Edwin Clark, an 82-year-old man with a gray beard, stood at the entrance, clutching an old coffee mug engraved with the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis. His army jacket, with the faded name Clark on the chest, hung loosely on his thin shoulders and on his left arm, just above the wrist. A tattoo was visible, an anchor and globe, faded to a pale blue but still recognizable to those who knew. His eyes, deeply set and slightly moist from the cold air, scanned the crowd. Children darted between tables, veterans exchanged quiet nods, and organizers bustled, checking guest lists. Edwin wasn't in a hurry to enter. His cane tapped against the wooden floor as he finally stepped inside, feeling the chill of the morning air give way to the warmth of the crowded hall. He hadn't been here in years. The last time was sometime in the 90s, when his wife Mary held his hand and whispered that he should tell the school kids about his medals. But Mary had passed 5 years ago, and since then, Edwin had avoided such events. They didn't remind him of glory, but of loss. The jungles of Vietnam, the cries of his brothers in arms, the letters home he never sent. But this year, something had changed. The night before, while sorting through an old box in the basement, he found a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1971. The headline read, "Local hero receives Silver Star for bravery." Below it was his name, Edwin J. Clark, and a photograph of him, young with a crew cut, standing with a medal pinned to his chest, staring into the distance as if seeing a future he didn't understand. That clipping brought him here. Not for himself, but for those who didn't come back. And maybe for Mary, who always said his story was worth telling. Edwin moved slowly between the tables, feeling the wooden floor creak under his boots. The smell of coffee mingled with floor wax, and the hum of voices blended with the distant laughter of children chasing each other on the lawn outside. He paused at the first table, where artifacts from World War II were displayed. A dented helmet, a soldier's letter to his mother, a Purple Heart medal. Edwin nodded, as if greeting an old acquaintance, and moved on. His eyes searched for something specific, though he wasn't sure what. Maybe a memory. Maybe proof that his years in the jungle hadn't been in vain. Finally, he saw it. In the far corner of the hall, under a glass case, lay a silver star. Beside it was a bronze star and a few ribbons he recognized instantly. His heart pounded, just as it had the last time he saw those medals, in 1972, when he donated them to a museum in Cleveland, thinking it was for the best. But now they were here, in Collins, and on a small plaque beneath the glass, he read, Edwin J. Clark, U.S. Marine Corps, Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. The plaque was new, but the medals were his. He recognized the scratch on the back of the silver star, left when he'd tucked it into his pocket during a firefight in the jungle. Edwin reached out, unthinking. His fingers stopped an inch from the glass. He didn't want to take them, just to touch, to feel the weight of that day when he ran through gunfire to pull 2 wounded men, Gomez and Laney, to safety. The day his platoon called him a hero, but he felt only like a tired 22-year-old kid who wanted to go home. "Hey, old man, don't touch the exhibits!" A voice sharp as a snapping branch cut through from behind. Edwin flinched, his hand freezing in midair. He turned and saw a young officer in impeccably pressed trousers and a shirt bearing the National Guard emblem. The man, no older than 30, stood with his hands on his hips, his name tag reading, Lieutenant Justin Weirs. His eyes, cold and impatient, looked at Edwin as if he were just another visitor breaking the rules. "I wasn't going to," Edwin began, his voice soft as a whisper of autumn leaves. "Rules are rules," Weirs snapped, his tone sharp as a blade. "These things aren't toys. They belong to history, not your hands. Step back, please." Edwin felt a hot wave rise to his cheeks. His fingers gripped the mug so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wanted to say these were his medals, his history, that he'd bled for them, lost friends, knights, peace. But the words stuck in his throat like dust from those jungles. He lowered his gaze and stepped back, feeling the glances of a few visitors, school kids, volunteers, slide over him and turn away. He was invisible again, an old man in an old jacket, with no right to touch history. Sorry, he mumbled, though Weers had already turned away, answering a school kid's question about a rifle at the next table. Edwin shuffled to the window, his cane thumping dully against the floor. Outside, children chased each other on the lawn, their laughter filtering through the walls, reminding him of his daughter, Marilee, and how she used to run on that same lawn, laughing as Mary called her home. Mary, who said his story was worth telling. He stood, staring at the flag flapping in the wind, and remembered that day in 1969. The jungle was quiet, too quiet, so he could hear the sweat dripping from his brow onto the ground. His platoon was in ambush, waiting for the enemy. Beside him was Private Gomez, a 19-year-old kid from Texas who cracked jokes to hide his fear. When the firefight erupted, time slowed. Gomez fell first, clutching his leg, then Laney, whose scream cut through the air. Edwin didn't think. He lunged forward, ducking as bullets whistled overhead. He dragged Gomez to cover, then went back for Laney. Later, when his platoon called him a hero, he felt only like a tired kid who wanted to go home. The medals came later, the Silver Star for valor, the Bronze Star for service. He gave them to the museum because he didn't feel worthy of keeping them. But now they were here in Collins, and the plaque with his name stared at him like a challenge. He turned back to the table, unable to tear his eyes from the medals. His fingers reached for the glass again, but stopped. He didn't notice someone in uniform watching him from the other end of the hall. "Those medals have a story," a voice said, deep and calm, with a note of respect. Edwin turned and saw an older man in an officer's uniform. His eyes, deep and familiar, had seen war. His name tag read, Colonel Jackson, retired. His posture was straight but not rigid, his gaze one that saw more than it seemed. "You serve?" the colonel asked, nodding at Edwin's tattoo. "Yes, sir. Vietnam. Marines, 68 to 70, Edwin replied, his voice quiet but steady. The colonel smiled, his eyes glinting. "I thought so. You've got the bearing. And the tattoo." He nodded at the medals. "Those yours?" Edwin hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about it. But something in the colonel's look, respect, understanding, made him nod. "Yes, sir. Gave them to a museum long ago. Didn't think I'd see them again." The colonel frowned, his gaze sliding to Lieutenant Weers, who was still talking to school kids, ignoring Edwin. "Someone should have known that," he said quietly but firmly. "Wait here." Edwin watched as the colonel strode toward Weers. His heart pounded like it had that day in the jungle. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt this moment would change the meaning of this day. The flag outside flapped, its rope slapping the pole, and Edwin thought maybe Mary was right. Maybe his story was worth telling after all. Edwin Clark stood by the window of the community center in Collins, Ohio, clutching his old mug with Semper Fidelis etched on it. The cold glass reflected his face, wrinkles, gray beard, eyes that had seen too much. Outside, the flag flapped in the wind, its ropes striking the pole, reminding Edwin of distant war drums. Inside, the hall buzzed. Children laughed, volunteers chattered, and the medals under the glass case, his medals, watched him silently, like old friends he hadn't seen in half a century. Lieutenant Weers, who had just sharply ordered him not to touch the exhibits, had turned away, busy with school kids crowding around the rifle table. Edwin felt invisible, as he had for much of his life after Vietnam, but someone saw. Colonel Jackson, retired, with gray at his temples and eyes that knew the weight of war, was walking toward Lieutenant Weers with a bearing that made people around him quiet. Edwin couldn't hear their conversation, but saw Weers frown, glance briefly his way, then nod as if receiving an order. The colonel returned to Edwin, his face calm but his eyes burning with resolve. "Come with me, Marine," he said softly but firmly, placing a hand on Edwin's shoulder. Edwin nodded, unsure where this was leading, but feeling he couldn't refuse. His cane tapped the floor as they slowly walked to the center of the hall, where a small podium stood, surrounded by chairs for guests. The colonel gestured for Edwin to sit in the front row, but he shook his head. "I'll stand, sir," he mumbled, gripping his mug tighter. The colonel nodded as if he understood and stepped onto the podium. He tapped the microphone, and the hum in the hall began to fade. Children stopped chasing each other. Volunteers froze. Even Lieutenant Weirs, standing off to the side, turned to listen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice deep as a church bell, "we're gathered here to honor those who served. But sometimes we forget that heroes aren't just in history books or museum cases. Sometimes they stand among us, quietly carrying their stories." Edwin felt his heart race. He lowered his gaze, afraid everyone was looking at him. But the colonel continued. "Today, I learned there's a man in this hall whose medals lie under glass. A man who, in 1969, in the jungles of Vietnam, risked his life to save two of his brothers. A man who received the Silver Star for bravery, but never asked for recognition. Edwin Clark, would you come forward?" The hall fell silent. Edwin felt his legs turn to lead. He wanted to vanish, to hide behind his invisibility, but the colonel's gaze, respectful, almost paternal, urged him forward. His cane tapped the floor, each step echoing in his chest. He stopped by the podium, his eyes fixed on the wooden floor, avoiding the hundreds of gazes now turned toward him. The colonel motioned to Lieutenant Weirs, who approached hesitantly, holding the glass case with the medals. His face was pale. His eyes avoided Edwin's, but he obediently set the case on a table beside the podium. "Lieutenant Weirs," the colonel said, his voice calm but with a hint of steel, "you told this man he couldn't touch these medals. But I think we all agree. If anyone has the right to hold them, it's him." The hall erupted in applause. Edwin flinched, unaccustomed to such noise. His eyes misted as he looked up and saw people, old and young, veterans and school kids, standing, clapping. Lieutenant Weirs, his cheeks now burning, held out the Silver Star to him, cradling it in both hands, like a sacred offering. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled, his voice trembling. "I didn't know." Edwin looked at the medal. His fingers, old and wrinkled, shook as he took it. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe his hands had grown weaker. He ran a finger over the scratch on the back, and memories flooded in like a tide. That day, in 1969, was sweltering, the jungle air thick as syrup. Edwin lay on the ground, his rifle heavy with moisture, his heart pounding as they waited for the enemy. Private Gomez, a 19-year-old kid from Texas, whispered jokes to ease the silence. "Clark, if we get out of this, I'm buying you a beer," he said, grinning. Edwin just nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. When the firefight broke out, time stopped. Gomez fell first, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. Laney screamed as a bullet hit his shoulder. Edwin didn't think. He lunged forward, ducking as bullets whistled overhead. He dragged Gomez to cover, his blood leaving a trail in the dirt. Then he went back for Laney, ignoring the sergeant's shouts to fall back. When it was over, Gomez lived. Laney didn't. Edwin sat in the mud, his hands shaking as Gomez whispered, "You're a hero, Clark." But Edwin didn't feel like a hero. He felt empty. Edwin stood on the podium, holding the medal, as the colonel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tell us, Edwin," he said softly. "Tell us what happened that day." Edwin shook his head, his throat tight. He'd never told this story to anyone, not even Mary, who knew only fragments. But the people's gazes, not curious, but respectful, urged him to speak. "It was a long time ago," he began, his voice trembling like leaves in the wind. "We were in an ambush. My guys, Gomez and Laney, they got hit. I just did what I had to. Pulled them out. But Laney? He didn't make it." The hall was silent, only the flag outside flapping, its rope striking the pole. Edwin felt a tear roll down his cheek, but didn't wipe it away. He looked at the medal, then at the people. "I'm no hero," he said quietly. "The heroes are the ones who didn't come back." The applause started slowly, but grew like a wave. Edwin lowered his gaze, his heart aching with pain and nostalgia. He thought of Mary, who always urged him to tell this story. Of Marilee, who was proud of him, though he never understood why. And of Gomez, who survived but died in a car crash in the 80s, never buying him that beer. The colonel raised a hand, calling for silence. "Edwin," he said, "you remind us why we're here. Not for the medals, but for those who stood beside us." He turned to Lieutenant Weirs. "Lieutenant, do you have anything to say?" Weirs stepped forward, his face pale, but his eyes sincere. "Sir," he said, looking at Edwin, "I made a mistake. I didn't know who you were, but now I do, and I extended his hand. I'm proud to stand before you." Edwin looked at the lieutenant's hand. For a moment he hesitated, then shook it. The grip was firm, and in Weir's eyes, he saw something new. Respect. The hall erupted in applause again. Children clapped, not fully understanding, but feeling the moment's weight. Veterans in the back stood, some brushing away tears. Edwin felt his shoulders straighten, for the first time in years. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Edwin sat by the window holding the silver star in his hands. Colonel Jackson approached, holding an old photograph he'd found among the exhibits. Edwin in 1971, young, with the medal on his chest. "This is yours," he said, handing over the photo. "And I spoke with the organizers. They want you to speak next year. Tell your story again." Edwin took the photo, his fingers trembling. He looked at the young version of himself, the one who didn't yet know how war would cast shadows over his life. He thought of Mary, who would have smiled at this day, of Marilee, now living in California, who might have come if she'd known. "I'll think about it, sir," he said quietly. The colonel nodded and left, leaving Edwin with his thoughts. Outside, the flag kept flapping, and Edwin felt something shift inside him. Not loud pride, but quiet dignity. He was no longer invisible. The next week, a plaque appeared by the community center in Collins in honor of Edwin J. Clark, Vietnam hero. Local veterans began meeting monthly, sharing their stories. And Edwin, though he didn't like the attention, sometimes came, holding his Semper Fidelis mug, listening as younger veterans called him Sir. This story is a reminder for us all. Heroes live among us, often unnoticed, carrying their stories quietly, like a flag in the wind. Pause. Listen. Reach out. A small act of respect can restore dignity and remind us who we are. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to hear more tales of quiet heroism in our communities.